3 o'clock in the afternoon where I am in Trondheim in Norway. Welcome and thank you all for joining PATHIS and the CIHE is that for this event. I am Dagrun Engen. I'm an assistant professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I'm also a board member of PATHIS, the Philosophy and Theory of Higher Education Society. Just to tell you a little bit about PATHIS in the beginning here, PATHIS is an international learned society, and our efforts are aimed at helping promote and sustain the efforts of scholars interested in or working in the field of philosophy and theory of higher education. We do have an interdisciplinary group of members, and we would like to have more members from around the world. We have an annual conference, and we are affiliated with a journal, the Philosophy and Theory in Higher Education, published by Peter Lang. And we have a reading club that meets once a month, seasons of weekly social meets, and we host and co-host events like this event today. And I would say a little bit more about some of the events and so on at the end of this webinar. But first of all, just welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tessa Delaquil. I'm a research associate and doctoral student with the Center for International Higher Education, or CIHE, and I'm so pleased to welcome you and have you all join us for this event. The CIHE is a major research center at Boston College. We believe that an international perspective is needed to foster enlightened policies and practices in higher education. Our activities include research, publications, training programs, and advisory activities done in collaboration with other research centers and scholars around the world, especially in emerging and developing countries. It is our pleasure to co-host this event with PATHIS today. Our event today, as many of you will know, is titled The Digitized University as Space, the Future of Home and Community in Higher Education Life, and will feature presentations by two prominent scholars whose expertise is focused on digitalization of higher education and the related themes that we will explore today. These include the philosophy and principles of new hybrids of the digitalized university as space with Dr. Rikke Nørgård, and a political economic perspective of digitalization of the university in relation to proprietary digital platforms with Dr. Janja Komljenovic.
Now, the format for today's event is as follows. Each speaker will present for approximately 10-12 minutes. And after that, the panelists will have the opportunity to pose each other some questions, followed then by audience questions and answers in the second half of our event. And also, please post your questions in the chat box as we go, during and after the talks, and we will be collecting and organizing your questions. And just a heads up that today's talk will be recorded. And now onwards to formally introduce our speakers for today. So our first speaker is Rikke Toft Nørgård. She's an associate professor in educational design and technology at the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University in Denmark. She's in the steering group of Center for Higher Education Future and board member of PATHIS. Rikke's research focuses on the complexities and interrelationships of technology, hybridity, culture and higher education design, and philosophy in relation to future education. She is consortium partner led in several funded projects with a particular focus on developing future higher education. Projects include VASE, Value Sensitive Design in Higher Education, Ignite, Design Thinking and Making in the Arts and Sciences, and STAC, Student Academic Digital Competencies in Higher Education. And Rikke Nørgård has published numerous articles and given keynotes on hybrid higher education, digital humanities, and designs for future higher education with a focus on higher education values, visions, and design for the future university.
And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Janja Komljenovic. Janja is a lecturer of higher education at Lancaster University. She is a Management Committee member of the Global Center for Higher Education, CIHE, and a co-director of the Center for Higher Education Research and Evaluation, SHARE, at Lancaster University. Her research focuses on the political economy of higher education and higher education markets. Komljenovic is especially interested in the relation between the digital economy and the higher education sector, and in digitalization, datafication, and platformization of universities. She leads the ESRC-funded research project, Universities and Unicorns, Building Digital Assets in the Higher Education Industry, which investigates new forms of value construction in digital higher education and employs a theoretical lens of rentiership and assetization. Komljenovic is published internationally on higher education policy, markets, and educational technology.
Okay. So I'd like now to invite Rikke to share her presentation.
Thank you, Dagrun, and thank you, Tessa, and thank you so much for inviting me. Let's see if I can multitask here. Yes, so you should be able to see my presentation now, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll try to keep within time as best as I can, and otherwise I will share the slides in the chat afterwards, so you can have a look at it if we don't get through it all. Thank you for the very nice introduction as well. I'll try to talk a bit of kind of a philosophical, theoretical view on the situation we find ourselves in now and in the future, and thinking about digitalization of higher education and higher education institutions from this kind of theoretical, philosophical perspective, focusing on hybridity. I also do what I call sometimes applied philosophy, so concrete educational developments and formats, actual practice. And if you look me up, you can find some publications on these more kind of practical matters. Yes, so very recently there came this report from European University Association called Universities Without Walls, a vision for 2030, and they have a conference next week actually that I'm also supposed to speak on, so that ties together nicely. And what's interesting about this report is that it actually kind of focusing on certain sections without beyond kind of sustainability and climate issues and democracy and other important issues, focusing on hybridity and digitalizations of universities. And they say that a key to success will be universities that are open, enforcing the vision of universities without walls, engaging deeply with other parts of society while firmly rooted in their values. Furthermore, they say that when looking to the future, we envision universities without walls. These are universities that are open and engaged in society while retaining their core values. So they provide an open, transformative space for common knowledge production through research, education, innovation, and culture. Also, they point towards that universities will continue to be characterized by being cooperative and networked institutions, locally, nationally, and internationally. And that kind of ties well with what I'll talk about in a second, hybridity, when they say that on the one hand, universities are places of respite and refuge, while on the other hand, they are actually involving citizens and non-academic partners. So this is what I would call like a hybrid entanglement, or one sort of hybrid entanglement. Finally, they say that the nature and structure of universities will be hybrid. In the future, this will entail that physical and digital learning and research environments must be designed in a holistic way to accommodate the different needs of a diverse university community and allow for flexible and blended approaches to explore new innovative ways of pursuing university missions. So this is kind of the foundation, or when looking to the future, that I primarily do in my research in philosophy and thinking. Okay, so what does all these kind of nice words, what do they actually mean? How could that look when we think about those philosophically? So one way of thinking about it, and a way I've been working with it, is working with the notion of hybrid university, and really trying to take the notion of hybridity philosophically and theoretically seriously. So what is a hybrid? Well, a hybrid is, we have a mule up here in the right corner, which is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse, But a hybrid is not a donkey horse, and it's not a horse donkey, but it's something other, something on its own, a heterogeneous new composite, a mule. So when we talk about hybrid universities and hybrid higher education, hybrid learning, and so forth, we're really talking about these new designs and formats that are something on their own. So that's also when I talk about something like the post-digital university, that it's not about if it's online or on-site, digital or physical, but these kind of new breeds or species. So hybridization describes the amalgamation process of developing these new hybrids, the process of designing for this new university or designing for new higher education. And hybridity is the phenomenon which describes the relationships between the hybrid and the hybridization, the coming into being, so to speak. So hybrid universities utilizes hybridization to dissolve dichotomies, which is kind of the main core point here, between, for example, traditional dichotomies between offline, online, digital, analog, formal, informal education, synchronous, asynchronous, and so forth, to create new hybrid spaces for all. Hybrid communication, collaboration, and community. And that's the Danish model to the right, where we had like the STAC project that was mentioned in the beginning, really trying to develop these formats. And the reasons for communication, collaboration, and community is that when we read into the literature and try to do literature studies on hybrid teaching and learning and hybrid education, these are the three main fields for developing hybrid learning environments. So some possible dimensions, as I mentioned, is online or on-site, open or closed, and so forth. And rather than thinking in either or terms, these are kind of dissolved into something new that we don't necessarily have proper names for yet. So what is an online, on-site, online university, for example? We don't really know yet. Or what is it for a university to simultaneously be on campus and at a cultural institution and at a company, and kind of being spread and sprawling across such dimensions? What we can say that is that it's like the focus is on hybrid entanglement and trying to kind of integrate and merge these hybrid connections in new ways in teaching and learning practices, institutional practices, and as a university, as an institution in itself. So based on this, higher education can be considered hybrid if it facilitates such an entanglement along these axes, and if it aims for becoming kind of a hybrid place, hybrid network, and a hybrid heterotopia. And I'll mention these now. So universities as hybrid places point towards trying to establish these new breeds, these new species, as something non-ephemeral, tangible, a real place, not something that's just out there in the cloud or somewhere, but it's somewhere we can feel at home. It's somewhere where we feel we belong. So one major danger with digitalizations of institutions is that there's a high risk of suddenly being someone without a place of one's own, being a persona non locata, as Gearin talks about. And this is as becoming almost non-existence, being homeless. And so one dimension of hybridity is really to focus on how to avoid this, how to actually have a university that to a meaningful extent can be a place to dwell in, even though it's hybrid. You have a co-ownership and you feel agency toward it. So it's an integrating campus when we talk about digitalization, and that's one hard focus point, is to think about how to create this somewhere and something for somebody, as Casey talks about. So if we want to have a placeful digital university, we have a responsibility as teachers, academics, institutional leaders, designers, evoked by drawing people together, fostering dwelling, inviting for joint placemaking in these hybrid forms, and really focusing on evoking care, collaboration, connectedness, and collective spirits in institutions that are digital. Then also university as hybrid networks. So here we're moving into kind of network learning, network thinking, more kind of digital practices. And here we see network learning being kind of integrated into hybrid digital universities, where institutions, society, teachers, researchers, students, employees, workers, and citizens enter into closer dialogue and partnership, as that it was also talked about in the report. And then it's really about thinking about how to not lose the university while being engaged in society, and how to create this knowledge together, and societal value, not only socio-economic value, and how to create a balanced dialogue so that university and society are both kind of networking and networked at the same time. So it becomes kind of an ecological system or world in the digital, in the hybrid. The last dimension that I would mention here, and which ties nicely together with kind of diversity and inclusion, is to think beyond the uniform digital platform of the university or the uniform campus, global campus, and see universities as digital hybrid heterotopias. And so heterotopia means other place. It comes from Foucault, and can position itself in multiple rooms at once. So as you can hear, it's quite connected to hybridity. So how do we not just have one system fits all here? How do we not just have a kind of become a number in a system and everything is kind of uniform? Rather see ourselves as rooms that can actually be incompatible, be heterogeneous, be rhizomatic, be impenetrable and permeable at the same time. So heterotopia is really aiming for a digitalization of universities that kind of highlights the difference, highlights diversity. Sometimes I differ between inclusion and diversity in the way that diversity is allowing everyone to be different on their own terms and trying to kind of encompass that, while inclusion is trying to include everyone in the same space. So hybrid universities are going more for that kind of heterogeneous diversity than the uniform kind of inclusion strategies. So I think I have like 5 minutes left. I'm just looking at background there. Yeah, okay. So if we are trying to kind of tie together these kind of philosophical underpinnings that I really likely just touched upon, and we can kind of discuss it afterwards, and then draw together all of kind of the design knowledge as well, because that's my the other half of me is kind of as a design philosopher, design thinker, educational developer. Okay, how can we kind of think philosophically about designing future institutions that are digital and hybrid? So the first one is really to, when we are designing new teaching formats, new learning environments, new institutional practices, to really focus on heterotopic places and hybrid knowledge forms. So in designing for the future university, these new breeds of higher education needs to be a fusion of separate parts that keeps the heterogeneity in place, so to speak. So it doesn't become uniform, it doesn't become what is called like a striated place where everything is the same, but is a smooth place where everything is different. And so it should really be an online digital environment that support and invite for rhizomatic, polyphonic, and heterogeneous knowledge forms. So it's not like multiple choice tests, handing something into the learning management system and so forth. It's more a vibrant matter, dialogue, where we are aiming for the known unknowns and sometimes perhaps even the unknown unknowns. And how do we do this together through networking, through hybridity practices? The other thing really to focus on is this, which is the core part of hybrid education, the dissolving of dichotomies through hybrid higher education. So how can we dissolve the dichotomy of asynchronous and synchronous? Can we be asynchronous and synchronous at the same time? Can we talk together in multiple ways? Can we participate in an on-site course even though we are on-site somewhere else, in a cafe or in a playground, and so forth? So it's this decomposition of dichotomies that are highlighted in the report, but also when we think about hybridity and hybridity in more philosophical terms. So it's a space of inclusion, not exclusion, and it's an approach, it's trying to approach different spaces, interaction, and experiences, a bit like an alchemist aiming to create gold through hybridization processes. So we have these really strange, a bit scary new creatures here on the left. how do we control these while keeping them uncontrollable in a certain way? How do we keep something open without losing everyone? So these kind of really, really hard questions are in the focus here. I have 5 points, so we are nearing the end. The other thing, which perhaps points towards the VASE project as well, the value-sensitive design in higher education, is to have value-sensitive hybrid homes. So really having the virtues of the university, the values of the university, front-loading the ethics before offering a system. So so when we talk about hybridity and read into that, then it's kind of characterized by open-endedness, risk-taking, experimentation, collaboration, dialogue, empathy, critical creativity, mutual care, commitment, and so forth. All these nice values, and we can't have them all, even though we would like to. So what kind of hybridity, what kind of alchemistic gold things am I trying to make here? Is it something highlighting experimentational practices? Is it something highlighting dialogue with society? Is it something highlighting empathy with stakeholders? And this is really important to kind of circumvent or disencourage sinister, cold-hearted hybrids, as I call them, like these kind of cold systems where you really feel just like a number and you're not anywhere and you're not anyone and there's nowhere to go. So this is kind of also pointing towards designing for hybrid communities that has kind of a breadth and a depth. So the depth is really thinking about the belonging, and when we are evaluating digital hybrid formats, asking about the values. So did you feel you belong? Did you feel heard? Did you have a voice? Were you able to engage and stuff like that? And the breadth is kind of the entanglement with the world. Did you feel part of the world? Did you feel that what you did mattered? So forth, the action you took. So it's also what is called like white walls. There's a lot of different stuff to do. It's not closed down. Low floors, everyone can enter, and high ceilings, we can think as crazy high, complex as we want to. Final part is hybrid universities exist as an in hybrid ecosystem. So for example, thinking about Ron Barner's work on the ecological university and so university as a societal driver, and these new kind of macro frameworks for the future universities. How does a single university fit within this? What is the hybrid? What kind of hybrid is Aarhus University, for example? Because hybridity also highlights these kind of digitalization processes as something that is uniquely different. So Aarhus University should be a uniquely different hybrid from Lancaster University or so forth. This is the last slide. So when we think about universities in 2030 or whatever, we should really think about them as placeful homes, belonging. How do we create belonging in the digital space and create hybrid places of the university? Networking lives. How do we create universities that invites for feeling alive in and being part of the world through networking and network higher education? And heterotopic communities. How do we ensure that knowledge and learning and practices are rhizomatic, heterogeneous, and you are your own person without being alone? So giving the floor to the next excellent keynote speakers, who I'm really looking forward to thinking and listening with, we could ask like, okay, but what kind of hybrids are emerging on the horizon, more practically, more politically? Are they makeshift or magnificent? Are they malign or benign? Are they invasive or native? And how might we work to ensure to breed or adopt hybrids that foster future homes and academic communities and digitized higher education lives that are not cold-hearted but warm-blooded? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rikke, for this insightful and also very thought-provoking presentation, giving us both a utopia and some challenges connected to that. I especially like the dissolving of dichotomies and the possibilities in thinking of the university as a hybrid space and what the hybridity will give us as from possibilities. Okay, we will be addressing questions to you, Rikke, after Janja's presentation. So please do post your questions in the chat box in the meanwhile.
I'd like to now welcome our next speaker, Janja Komljenovic. The floor is yours, Janja.
Can you see my slides? Brilliant. Thank you, Tessa and Dagrun, for inviting me, and thanks, Rikke, for the excellent talk. So when Rikke and I were discussing today's event, we decided that the notions of hybrids and hybridity would be our connecting idea, which was good for me because Universities and Unicorns is a title of my new research project that I just started in January. And unicorns are a type of hybrid. And I thought that was a terribly clever title of my project because on the one hand, I mean companies worth more than $1 billion, which is something that we now also see in education technology. So at the moment, there are 20 such companies as estimated by Holon IQ. But on the other hand, there are also these magical creatures symbolizing purity, innocence, power that people chase and pursue, and they are hard, if not impossible, to get. So something similar to this kind of wide-eye startup entrepreneurs chasing the idea of becoming a unicorn. So when we think about digitalized universities, universities all around the world are fast digitizing and digitalizing, and quite often or mostly they digitalize through proprietary digital products and services that are delivered via digital platforms, and they can be seen as programmable socio-technical intermediaries between multiple actors. Now these platforms that universities use and engage with are very, very diverse. So they can be, as I mentioned, proprietary, but they can also be locally constructed. They can be coming from big tech companies. Just imagine Microsoft or Google, who are quite decisively penetrating the education sector, or they might be prepared and constructed by education specific and quite new startup companies. They might be free, they might be payable, they might be for profit or not for profit, and we as users can act as users or producers at the same time, or buyers and sellers. So there's this huge ecology in terms of what they cater as well. So either they support teaching and learning, like virtual learning environments, but then also business, just business management of universities, or managing research processes and so on. So we really see this kind of very dynamic, changing complexity of digital ecosystems in the higher education sector, broadly conceived. Now, what we see here is that these ecosystems also leverage complementarity. So these actors are interdependent and they jointly develop these digital assets. And the promise here is that contribution to such an ecosystem reaps greater value as well as profits than trading outside of this platform. So actors are motivated to participate. Now, how are these proprietary digital platforms governed is not through markets of commodities where you would see the exchange of commodities and property rights for paying a price, but through so-called rentiership and assets. So that implies that there is an entrepreneurial and investor strategy of owning and controlling digital platforms, including who gets to access these platforms and what happens on these platforms, including the follow-through rights. And for allowing this use of such digital service, they charge rent. That rent comes in monetary terms, such as various kinds of subscriptions or fees per click, fees per user, and so on, that are in the higher education sector quite often paid by universities instead of students and staff. But The rent is also in the form of data. So there are authors who call this, like Jathan Sadowski, he calls this data rent, which is we as digital users leave behind personal data as we engage with these platforms, and this data can then be made valuable, monetized, and made useful quite often by platform owners and data controllers. So it goes beyond let's say the use of the higher education sector proper. Now, in what follows, I will address 4 potential broader implications for the higher education sector, and then I will conclude with playing this idea, with the idea of complexity of hybridity that Rikke so well elaborated already. The first potential implication is around the nestedness of platforms, digital platforms, and then data policies around them that we can now find in the higher education sector. So we can think about this ecosystem as having 3 levels of digital platform integration, where at the first level, we can think about it as full integration that allow full data flows, such as, for example, virtual learning environments, integrating with other digital databases at universities, such as staff or student databases. The second level is so-called nested platforms, where some data flows are allowed, but not entirely, such is the case of MOOCs or OPMs, or even just embeddedness of, say, YouTube videos on various kind of digital platforms within universities. Or there might be the third level of external development, where universities are actually developers, such as, for example, if they develop very specific tabs on Facebook university pages, where they actually develop Facebook as a platform, but they don't integrate it with their own digital infrastructures at all. Now, what is interesting here is that students and staff, as we go about our daily lives, we have to comply not only with university policies and rules, but also with terms and conditions of these external platform owners and controllers. It's quite likely that we don't even know with how many we are actually complying, or quite often we are diverted to accept external terms and conditions without even realizing or reading it. Now, what that means for space, home, and community, which is kind of the title of this event, is if we think about personal digital data as an extension of self, this is what Salome Villon calls dignitarian view as opposed to proprietarian view of digital data, then the spaces where we are controlled actually move from the kind of higher education sectorial or even local university to these private companies potentially across the world. Now, what happens in these new spaces, and quite often the data, or always I should say, is aggregated, analyzed, turned into intelligence, and made valuable at this aggregated level. Just think about learning analytics, for example, or the promise of personalized education. I like to play with the idea of precision education today. It's kind of like black box and hidden. So we don't really know how these, in detail, how these algorithms work, what kind of personalized recommendations, targeted recommendations they make. And in this sense, algorithms and predictions could be seen as new higher education community members doing work and having some sort of agency supporting decisions. Now, the second group of potential changes is the parallel rise of contractual governance to the public governance of higher education. So obviously, public law, public education law still applies, However, when universities kind of engage with these proprietary external platforms, they negotiate contracts, and they are in different power positions when they're negotiating these contracts. So they might have different conditions of operation, even with the same platform. So platforms can apply different conditions to different universities, or universities may be in a position to kind of have different conditions for different platforms. This is all contractually governed. Most often it's even classified as commercially sensitive. So we do have a potential problem here with public accountability. That's when we are thinking about kind of like business to business relations. But if we think about platform to user relations, we come into the territory of terms and conditions or terms of use, which also have a legal status of contracts, but they govern the relations between platforms and users. This is, you know, where we always consent and click and go on. There are problems with power relations here, because as users, we either have a choice of accepting all of the terms and conditions if we want to use these services and products, or we can't use them at all. So we can't really choose not to. There is also an interesting potential ambiguity here in terms of mergers and acquisitions, because in the digital economy, this is quite a common sort of behavior or phenomena, where we see daily really which tech company acquired some other tech company, either to scale their business, work across the business lines, and so on. And we can also see that happening in education technology. So Salome Avillon, that I mentioned already before, talks about this vertical and horizontal governance, where vertical means this kind of relationship between the user and platforms, but then horizontal refers to aggregated data that is actually then of interest, where we are put in groups and we are classified together with other users at the bigger scale. So it becomes much more relational. Now, at the moment of data production, we cannot even imagine what will happen with our personal data in future, or in which spaces, or these spaces might potentially change, including in governance and rights over this data. So we can think about temporal and spatial black boxing of this dynamic. The third phenomena is what I call reinstitutionalization of higher education. And here, if we think about higher education very broadly, maybe even lifelong learning 2.0, we can see an interesting phenomena. So on the one hand, authors write about the so-called unbundling of universities as they engage with digital platforms, either in cutting down full degrees into shorter sort of modules or deliveries, but also in terms of how they deliver the programs, like, for example, digital online programs together with OPM companies, or we see the rise of micro-credentials, stackable degrees that are offered even by other actors and not universities. At the same time, the majority of investment in edtech platforms goes into those platforms that are targeting individuals directly, so circumvening universities as institutions entirely. What we also see happening is this emergence of new rules, norms, and forms of recognition of this kind of knowledge and skills that is being established. So even potentially being included in national qualification frameworks. This kind of new, so I wouldn't say that we are deinstitutionalizing higher education of potentially kind of universities, cutting universities out, but reinstitutionalizing in this complexity of new rules. So it seems that then the space, home, and community becomes much more networked, plural, dynamic, complex, and constantly changing, and where education is turned into this form of education, higher education as a service, and just in time kind of delivery of skills in this mapping of digital work and digital training and learning. The final trend is around the conditions of competition, innovation, and monopoly. If we can think about monopolies in two ways, so platform monopolies versus market monopolies. In terms of platform monopolies, or shall I say, in the education technology industry, the promise of innovation, disruption, you know, this kind of new ideas is kind of at the core. But platforms are protected from competition by being assets, so having copyright and patents, in a sense inherently kind of prohibiting competition or developing this kind of innovation. So we see a tension really here, and in terms of data monopolies, the question really is who owns the large data sets at the aggregated level so that they can then be processed. So Katarina Pister here talks about that raw data is obviously not rivalrous, and the nature of digital data here is of interest. You know, how we think about digital data, is it labor, intellectual property, capital, and so on. It's a very interesting debate in itself. But what is rivalrous is basically the algorithms and predictions. So who has power to kind of enclose the data to come up with these algorithms and predictions. And finally, around the market monopolies in the digital economy more broadly, we see that the biggest kind of competition is happening between USA, so United States and China. And we see that also in education technology, that most investment by far in education technology happens in these two countries, potentially now also rising in India and EU, but that's more or less kind of it. So we see really new geopolitical orders and centers emerging. Finally, we see also the crossing of the business lines. So obviously we already have that with you know, the likes of Google and so on entering higher education, but then also higher education specific platforms seem to have the tendency to grow in terms of the service and their users. What that means for space, home, and community is these new centralization versus decentralization debates around geography, but then also sectors. And we see hybrids of these industries in one platform. So higher education can become only one of the fields there. Now to conclude, and I will be very, very brief here, you know, it's not just dichotomies and tensions, but if we have these very complex ecologies encompassing the private and the public digital products and services, local and global, mono or multiple business lines, supporting the university service at the very location, or extending global markets by digital means, or some of them being transparent, some more or less transparent, let's say. And we can think also about the other elements and tensions of this kind of hybrid digital ecologies that we see emerging in higher education. So I'll stop here. I think I was provocative enough to motivate the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janja. That was a really fascinating analysis of the strategies and policies of digitalization and platform integration within the ecosystem. I found the idea of data rentiership especially valuable, and we often don't think about our relationship within the larger digital ecosystem and what the implications are. So in the interest of time, we're going to skip the conversation and move straight to the very interesting questions that we have already in the chat. And also in the interest of time, instead of taking questions individually, Dagrun and I have sort of themed the questions together, and we'll present Janja and Rikke with the themes that have emerged from the questions. So one of the larger themes that's come up several times is that of ethics or principles in the idea of hybridity and the university. We've had questions around whether there are rules or boundaries or principles involved with the idea of the hybrid university and hybridity in university spaces, whether there are ethical policies we could talk about, and specifically around the questions of access and equity and global inequality. So if either of you would like to address that question. first?
Should I start, Janja, and then you can kind of continue?
Sure.
I'll
Yeah.
try to do it very briefly. I think it's a very important question. One place where I've tried to address it, well, first of all, I would say like the whole framework of hybrid education and hybrid institutions that we worked on developing for the last 5 years are kind of built on the concept of signature design and signature pedagogy. So it's really about having the front loading the values. So starting with the values, then developing the deep pedagogy, and then starting to think about concrete technologies, concrete formats, concrete practices, materials, acts in the classroom or as an institution, rather than starting at the top. So that's one way of going around it, using the master framework of signature pedagogy. Another way is in the networking university chapter I did together with Janja and Søren Bengtsen. We pointed towards the Rochdale principles for cooperatives, which are very old. I think it's from the 1800s, as a framework for thinking about more kind of horizontally connected, flat, democratic institutions, trying to build them. So I think that's like really hard ethical principles and quite hard pedagogical principles built into the notion of hybridity and hybrid education, a bit like the field of network learning, I would say.
Yes, and I would just add to that we also need to think about the political economic kind of underlying questions around ethics of this. So I quite like authors who are working on these new ideas around governing digital economies more broadly. So, for example, Salome Villon talks about democratic relational data governance and the need for transparency. So, because at the moment we see this development where the platforms are privately controlled, data is extracted, and then again kind of privately controlled with where we don't really know what's happening. There's problem with access, innovation, and use. So I think that the ethical question in this respect is very much how can we think about digital ecologies and digital data that is being extracted in this accessible, democratic, and relational ways. So should we think about potential data commons or syndicates, or who should govern that, who can access that, what would be the rules, what's basically the international kind of possibilities here, because I mean, it is, I guess, in our interest that we do allow data aggregation for data use for the general societal good and to the benefit of society. So, but these kind of structural economic questions are not really commonly asked when we think about, you know, the digital university. We think about the network learning, this kind of pedagogical principles, but not that much about these kind of ethics just of governance or politics and economics of it. I'd also like to just mention here that when we think about these networks, it comes natural in education to think about network learning, but this is also about network effects and kind of business economics of network effects, and this kind of you know, scaling platforms for growing networks at any cost for these kind of economic purposes. So for me, you know, the question of ethics is very important in these underlying building blocks of these digital economies.
Thank you both. I think another one of the big questions people have been bringing up are the role of stakeholders. So there are so many stakeholders when we have these hybrid forms, more than usual. And how we engage the stakeholders already in the traditional university spaces, and how we ensure that they're engaged in the creation of these sort of kind-hearted, purposeful learning environments that Rikke talks about. And what happens when we have spontaneous encounters with people outside the typical, so strangers, outside that typical space. Yeah, so how to use those to create community.
Yeah, so there's multiple stakeholders, of course, as in any context, I would say. I think some of the, well, at least in the Nordic universities, probably also the European and elsewhere, we see like this, I think what I would call like an uneven dialogue at the moment, if it's a dialogue at all, where kind of universities are leaping for society and trying to either give the students a job after their ended studies or have value in society in a kind of harder economic way. And then stakeholders become someone that we should kind of leap for. Like we have we have excellence tracks, we have incubators, we have a new master big strategy at Aarhus University at the moment called the AU Kitchen, where you can come and build a company or I don't know, make a company. And the Danish bank, the Danish companies can come into the university and offer cases that students can work on, and it becomes kind of a free labor force of some sorts. And a lot of kind of the deep academic thinking, the refugee camp for thinking, as they talked about in the University Without Walls, are in fear of actually disappearing. So I think one thing thinking about stakeholders is engaging stakeholders, inviting stakeholders through participatory design processes or other processes, network learning processes, but really having a dialogue about not leaping for them, not giving value to them, but entering into a dialogue. And that's a very different thing than trying to engage a company through internships or through an excellence track or as an incubator. And I think that whole vocabulary, so originally I'm from Nordic language and literature, working with poetry and stuff, so that words matter, and we need to be really careful about how we talk about this and what words we use when we engage society, when we engage stakeholders, how we present ourselves. It's not leaping for them, but it's working together, it's thinking together, it's building a home together, and so forth, I would say.
Thanks, Rikke. I entirely agree. Maybe just to add here that with Rila Rapper, a colleague from Durham University, we're thinking about the difference between governing with data and of data as well. So just in terms of governing with data, it seems that there is some sort of stakeholder consultation happening, but not very much when we think about governing of data, and then it becomes much more messy and complex, which would then have impact on what Rikke was just saying. So who gets to kind of decide what you do potentially with all of this infrastructure and data that is collected and should be kind of made useful to stakeholders actually.
I think we'll do one last question. There have been so many, I'm sorry we weren't able to address them all. But I think this question from Patrick probably sits in all of our hearts, where we ask what the university role is in hybridization, especially in relation to academic freedom. So what would be needed for universities to take back ownership of the digital infrastructure that they need to? And I think maybe this is a question more for Janja, but also I'm sure Rikke has thoughts on this.
Okay, a very big question for the end and the final 4 minutes. I mean, maybe I can start answering in very technical terms first. In terms of academic freedom, we can already see here differences between kind of legislation in different countries and also institutions, just in terms of how they govern the digital outputs, right? So now, especially in the time of COVID, where all of the education has moved online and academics recorded new videos, made new digital kind of products and so on. So the question is, who owns them? And then also, are they prone to different kinds of surveillance? So there was also some research kind of showing that academics were afraid of surveillance being monitored, and this kind of digital technology bringing in new kind of possibilities of surveillance and managing of their labor and their freedom as well. So I think that's one side of the story. And then also, not only what you get to do, but then also just who owns the products of the academic labor as well. Is this the university, and can the university just really use it perpetually into the future, or is this the individual academic? So in the case of the UK, the university owns these digital outputs, but I know this is not the case everywhere. That's one side of the story. The second kind of important element here is the academic freedom of staff and students, just in terms of analytics and predictions. So these algorithms, most often provided by private actors, offer advice and solutions, on what to read, what to do, how to behave. Are you kind of considered a person at risk, either as a student or staff, and just kind of helping in management decisions in terms of, or intermediating in the managing of people as well as the pedagogic processes. So there's the notion of robot pedagogy and so on. So this is also kind of impacting just the academic freedom and professionalism that is happening there. And then what is the role of university? I think that's a really good question that I'm not really sure I have the answer to, but what I do see happening is this profound resectoralization and expansion, of the higher education sector. So in the language of the edtech industry and investors, the role of the university is quite heavily reduced to this, the employability, digital skills. It's very much this language that is being enforced, and even kind of, matching the digital kind of labor markets and needs there, and digital skills, and just providing this kind of technology will provide this just in skills delivery. And some universities are quite happily kind of getting on board with working with companies on this and unbundling. But obviously, for many people, this is not the role of universities. And I think this is exactly the time to have these kinds of debates. What kind of universities do we actually want, and what is the role here? I'll stop now because I see it's just a minute left, and if Rikke has anything to add.
I'll add something really briefly, because I think Tessa and Dagmar might also have something to say when rounding up. And also connecting to another question in the chat about the ground. So rather than thinking about building shiny, global, all-consuming platform campuses, more thinking about 1 million micro hybrids on the ground shared, and that are quite messy and useless. So rather than making shiny videos of lectures that can be reused over and over again, because that's actually not good pedagogy either, it closes down the dialogue often, then have these messy events, like this is a messy event right now. It's recorded, but it won't happen, make do so that I won't speak again, or Janja won't speak again, because this is a dialogue. It's quite messy. Yeah, there are some slides and stuff like that, but it's a one-off. So thinking about one-off pedagogy, hybrid pedagogy, rather than a universal, never-ending platform, I think is one thing. The last point I will make is around the pandemic. Really be careful not to build post-pandemic education on pandemic experiences, because the teaching, learning, and educational practice during the pandemic is rather useless in the bad term of that word, because it's emergency teaching, it's panic, it's using technologies that might not be good for the universities when it comes to data and so forth, but we are trying to survive here. So reconnecting with deep theory, reconnecting with ethical practice, reconnecting with pedagogical values when we come out on the other side, transformed as a new hybrid, slimy, trying to breathe and learn.
Thanks to you both. What a great way to round up this excellent webinar. Thanks to our panelists, Rikke and Janja, for sharing your insights with us. Just before we close, because we assume our audience shares our love for international higher education and or philosophy of higher education, we do have a few events coming up that may be of interest. Dagrin, do you want to share the Pathos events?
Yes, very briefly, let me just share with you. You can see now that this is from the Pathos website, pathos.org. We have this event now, and we have one in April and one in May, and you can just go into our website to see more about these events. And there are both sort of linked to the many of the questions that has come up today and some of the ideas that we have been discussing here today as well.
Also at CIHE, we have some events coming up, May 18th and June 15th, co-hosted events with the International Association of Universities. You can register for these events here. One is a continuation of today's topic in some ways, the digital dimension, open science in a closed world. And on the 15th of June, we have family-owned and managed universities, an important but unknown global phenomenon. We also have our annual West CIHE Summer Institute coming up in June, which you can register for here. And if you'd like to stay connected, please follow Pathos or BC CIHE on Twitter. And you can also subscribe to our open access journal. We have a new issue that just dropped on Friday. So do check it out. And once again, thanks to our panelists and for all of you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at a future event soon. Thank you.